I am Professor Suchismita Das. I am an anthropologist, an assistant professor at Ahmedabad University, and also a fellow of the Center for Interasian Research. So this series, which we began, series of webinar talks called Perceptions of Risk in the Himalayas, we started in December 2023, and our goal has been to try to denaturalize the concept of risk and to bring together scholars from different disciplines and think about how the concept of risk has influenced how the Himalayas are seen, studied. And some of these talks by anthropologists, historians, earth scientists are available on our Ahmedabad University YouTube channel if you want to go back and have a look at it. Uh, we are very glad today to continue this conversation and think about risk from an ecological perspective with Dr. Rohit Naniwadekar, who will be talking today on a talk which is titled Of Herons, Hornbills and Humans, Stories of Survival and Connections in the Eastern Himalaya. Dr. Naniwadekar is a community ecologist and conservation scientist with the Nature Conservation Foundation in Mysore. He completed his master's in wildlife sciences at the Wildlife Institute of India at Dehradun in 2005, and then his PhD from the Nature Conservation Foundation and Manipal University in 2014. His research group, which works across four biodiversity hotspots across South Asia and Southeast Asia, focuses on plant and animal interactions, the impact of human activities on endangered biodiversity and ecosystem functions, and ecological restoration. Rohit is known to a lot of us have heard about his work on hornbills in Northeast India. And amongst his studies, he has tried to understand the frugivory and seed dispersal of hornbills and their conservation status in Arunachal Pradesh. Telemetry study to understand the movement patterns of hornbills, a survey of hornbills across 5 states in Northeast India to try to understand their distribution. Well, as we'll see today, he's also not only interested in hornbills, but the larger avian population and its linkages to human culture as well. In today's talk, Rohit will explore the interconnected themes of rivers, forests, and people, three essential elements of the Eastern Himalaya. Drawing on his research in the Eastern Himalaya and Northeast India since 2006, he will share three stories. The first story concerns the critically endangered white-bellied heron and its quiet disappearance from the Himalayan rivers. The second highlights the deep bond between the endangered hornbills and the forest that they call home. And the third delves into the complex and interconnected relationships between hornbills, humans, and the habitats they share. So thank you again, Rohit, for joining us today. And I'll turn it over to you for another 40-45 minutes, and then we can take the Q&A from the audience.
Thank you so much, Suchismita and Tejaswini and Satvik and CIR for giving me this opportunity. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I really hope that I'm able to share my enthusiasm and also some of my despair with you all over the next 45 minutes. I'll just share my screen. And Suchismita, if you can confirm it's all fine.
Yes, looks good.
Thank you so much. So I'll be talking about three stories today. One of a heron, of the hornbills, and the people who share their habitats with the species. And Eastern Himalaya does not need any introduction. The heavy rainfall in the landscape, along with the very wide elevation gradient, has meant that we have wet evergreen forests in the low elevations and the temperate forests and the alpine meadows that eventually transition into the Trans-Himalayan. Now, such diverse habitats, along with the strategic geographical location of this landscape at the junction of the Indo-Myanmar region, as well as at the junction of at the Palearctic, has meant that there is tremendous biodiversity in the region. If you go to places like Eagle's Nest in the western Arunachal Pradesh, per square kilometer, I think it has the second highest diversity of birds in the world. And so along with these tall mountains, what are also very important features and the forests are these rivers that flow. And these snow-fed rivers often can be really, change their courses in the monsoon, and they create a diverse habitats for the species to live and persist. Now, the Eastern Himalayan state of Arunachal Pradesh, if you see here in the northeastern corner of India, also is blessed with extensive forest cover. If you compare it with other states in India, you can see that More than 60% of its land is under forest cover as per the Forest Survey of India in 2021. Now, these forests, along with harboring the diversity of along with harboring tremendous biodiversity, are also harboring tremendous cultural diversity. In the state of Arunachal Pradesh, for example, there are 26 different tribes and more than 100 sub-tribes. And this is only within an area of about 85,000 square kilometers. And each tribe having its own customs and traditions and language. And so also speaks about the volumes about the importance of this place, not just for biodiversity, but also for the people. Now, the people who stay in these landscapes also share strong bonds with the species and the habitats and all that. And therefore, looking at biodiversity or the habitats or the species without people, or looking at people without biodiversity, will actually do a lot of injustice. So today, what I'll start with is the story of this heron, right? Everybody, most of us here would have seen a heron. Herons, you see them in ponds and urban tanks and lakes, and so this is a species that the group as such does not need particular introduction. But the white-bellied heron is a special case. It's a highly specialized bird, and I'll talk more about it over the next few slides. Now, the Eastern Himalayan part of Arunachal Pradesh is also blessed with a lot of rivers. Here you have the Noading River, which is in the extreme east corner. Then you have the Lohit, Dibang, Siang, Subansari, Kameng, all of them arising in the high Himalaya and providing tremendous diversity of habitats for the river birds to occupy. You will have sections of the river that flow fast. You'll have mid-flowing sections. You'll have stagnant, deep pool areas, and then the banks would have rocks or sands. And so these diversity of habitats that occur along these rivers also harbor a great diversity of river birds that are found to inhabit these riverine habitats. These river birds are of different shapes, sizes, and colors, and they feed on diverse array of things from vegetation matter, vegetative matter to insects and to fishes and other vertebrates. Now, if you look at the diversity of riverine birds in the world, you will notice that the diversity of riverine birds is highest in the Eastern Himalayan region. So this map shows the number of species of river birds across the world, and the Eastern Himalayan region has more than 10 species of river birds that are found in this habitats. Of course, the actual diversity is much more higher than 10. What we are going to focus today is one such unique species that inhabits these river systems, which is the white-bellied heron. Now, the white-bellied heron occupies freshwater systems, which are basically river systems, which are braided rivers, and occupies flowing water habitats. Now, these birds perch on these rocks, and then they hunt for fishes, which is their preferred prey. Now, the global population of these herons is less than 50 birds, and this is one of the second largest heron in the world. And typically, large-bodied animals face more threats to their persistence or are more threatened compared to their smaller-bodied close relatives. As I said, they perch along these rocks, waiting for an fish that they can grab. And this is a resource that they often share with humans. Now, if you look at the historical distribution of the white-bellied heron, you can see that they occurred from southern Myanmar to almost eastern Nepal. But if you start looking at records from 1980 onwards, which are the blue triangles, you will see that most of them are restricted between northern Myanmar to Bhutan. Now, how come I happened to start studying these birds is because of these two people, Rohan Menzies and Megha Rao. They approached me in 2016 and they said that they wanted to start a conservation program for the white-bellied heron in Namdapha Tiger Reserve. I had done my PhD and I had spent almost 6 years doing fieldwork in Namdapha from 2006 and 2012. And I was fairly familiar with the landscape. And personally, I had seen the bird and I had ticked it off my list. I never knew that I would engage in studying this bird in detail over the next few years. Now, Rohan and Megha, when they said that they wanted to start a conservation program, I said, wait, that time the situation in Namdapha was not very conducive to start a conservation program. And moreover, we hardly knew about the ecology of the species or even its distribution in the entire Eastern Himalayan part of Arunachal Pradesh. And so they set out to start doing a survey for the white-bellied heron across the state of Arunachal Pradesh, and they sampled all the 7 drainages in Arunachal from Dihing, Lohit, Dibang, Siang, Subansari, and the Kameng. They also sampled in the neighboring parts of Assam, which is adjoining the Manas Tiger Reserve, and in Royal Manas in Bhutan, there is a population of the white-billed heron. Now, when they did the surveys, they found that the heron was only found in these 2 sites. One is in the Namdapha Tiger Reserve, and of course, the 3 individuals that come into the Manas from the Royal Bhutan part. And therefore, basically, what they found is that in their field surveys, they did not detect this rare species. They also happened to speak to a lot of local fishermen to ask them if they knew about the existence of the species and whether they had seen the heron. And most of the fishermen they spoke to were not able to identify the heron, let alone confirm the presence of the species. So based on the field surveys and based on these key informant surveys that they did, they're fairly confident that either the heron is very, very rare or it is not present in these other drainage systems. Now, this is a bit surprising because, most of these rivers still continue to be free flowing and they harbor good, at least visually very good habitats for the river birds to occupy or for the heron to occupy. And yet we fail to find the species in this other drainages in Arunachal Pradesh in Eastern Himalaya. Now, people have been speculating that this bird prefers less disturbed habitats, and therefore what we did is we compared the, the presence of this bird, which was in Namdapha Tiger Reserve, with other non-protected areas and other protected areas. And we found that, yeah, there was some evidence to that Namdapha did not have any mining and it had relatively lower presence of humans based on the garbage that we did not detect inside Namdapha as compared to other sites. And this probably gives some credibility to the fact that the species really probably prefers areas with low human disturbance. But what was surprising is that Rohan really got hooked to studying river birds, and he decided to do his PhD on river birds from Nature Conservation Foundation, and then he decided to go back to Namdapha and study the white-bellied heron along with the other river birds in this landscape. In February 2023, both Rohan and I spent almost 30-40 kilometers walking the same stretches of rivers that we had sampled in 2017. We did not see the heron during our sampling. We saw a single individual somewhere here. From November to March, Rohan spent 5 months in the field, walking along almost 100 kilometers along these stretches. Again, did not detect the heron during the sampling period. Now, in 2017, when we had sampled the landscape, the encounter rates of the heron was about 0.5 per kilometer, which means that every 2 kilometers, we were seeing a heron. But here, despite sampling for more than almost close to 100 kilometers, we did not detect them during our sampling, but we, of course, occasionally saw them in different parts of the river. But again, indicating that this bird had become very rare in an area where it was fairly commonly seen. In fact, this was one of the favorite haunts for the tourists to go and twitch, especially these professional bird watchers, they go and twitch these birds. So to twitch the white-bellied heron, they would often come to these areas and then they would find the heron. But talking to locals and talking to other bird watchers and all that, we realize that now the tourists, thanks to the road that has been constructed, are able to access more high elevation points. And there they are probably getting to see 1 or 2 birds during the service. But basically, to cut a long story short, that in just about 7 years, that we found that in areas which are relatively well protected, that the bird was not detected in these river systems. Now, Rohan fortunately also had collected the habitat data that time and also had collected data on fishing persistence through indirect evidences like seeing fishing nets or through other evidences of fishing like dried fish and all that. What he found is that there was not too much difference in the habitat. There was, of course, no difference in the habitat per se because it's within a protected area. And of course, the fishing science is actually a bit declined than what they were there earlier. And despite that, despite that, he did not really detect the species. Of course, we saw more signs of more invasive forms of fishing like blasting and electrofishing and all that. But then we, of course, did not have data on whether the fish resources itself have changed over time and whether that is impacted. But what I want to harp here is that, you have a species for which the ecological information is based on surveys, is based on anecdotal natural history observations or focal animal observations and all that. Unlike, say, the hornbills and all that, these are really, really, really understudied birds. And even in the best of protected areas, at least in terms of the Arunachal Pradesh, in terms of the river systems and all that, where they're not dammed, they are not altered, and seemingly no difference in change of habitat, you are seeing that the species is slightly making a slow exit. Of course, along with, this is could also be our failure to document the changes that perceive the threats that the birds is facing. But also it could be also because of the fact that this bird is an extreme low density. You see a heron every 2 kilometers, and you're talking about few or tens of square kilometers of river stretches in these habitats. This bird is actually very rare. And so sometimes even stochastic processes associated with small population sizes can result in, reduction in local populations. But of course, we do not know whether it's deterministic processes or whether it is the stochastic processes that are causing the decline in these birds. Now, imagine even if we are able to, through some sense, boost the population of the species, it is going to be a big challenge. Bhutan, when I said that the global population is about 50 birds, the less than 50 birds, less than 10 birds are in this Namdapha and adjoining areas of Kamlang and Bolong and those areas. Most of the population is now in Bhutan. Bhutan has actually been able to start a conservation breeding center for these birds, and they are able to at least breed some birds in captivity. They are also monitoring rigorously the populations in the wild there. We've not invested as much effort as, say, Bhutan has done. And clearly now with less than 10 individuals, even thinking of starting a conservation breeding center in Eastern Arunachal Pradesh is going to be a bit challenging. And so therefore, boosting its population size itself is going to be a big challenge. It's going to be a big conservation challenge. What I also want to reiterate here is that here we have a species, it seems to be extremely fragile, and it occupies the sensitive, habitats, which are also compared to the forest habitats and the forest birds relatively less studied, is again, slowly making a silent exit. And while we sometimes joke with Rohan, we fear that what he's doing with his river bird research is probably documenting an extinction of the species. And I really hope against hope that it doesn't happen. But by some miracle, even if we are able to safeguard or boost the population, what is the future for this bird? Given the low population densities, we will need large undisturbed habitats. But if you just look at this map here, where I'm showing the dams that are proposed in Arunachal Pradesh, more than 150 dams have been proposed in Arunachal Pradesh. And you can see basically every drainage is lit with these red polygons, which basically indicate the location of the dams. This river bird, unlike its close relatives like the grey heron, requires free-flowing rivers, requires braided river ecosystems. By these hydroelectric projects, the river flow is going to get altered. Its habitat is going to get altered. Probably its prey base is going to get altered. All of this means that even if we are able to boost the population, a species which occurs in low density probably will have nowhere to go. It's already gone locally extinct, probably in China. In Myanmar, the population is uncertain. People are unable to go to Myanmar and survey the population because of the political instability there. Also because of other threats like hunting, which have been documented in that region. And therefore, the future is bleak. And by having all of these dams, which will come up in the near future, or which are proposed at least in the near future, which will mean that even if the populations do increase, they will not have habitats probably to occupy. So a quick summary of this part is that, you have a species which is extremely fragile, which is occupying these fragile ecosystems, which has from the 1950s, its habitat being shrunk, for reasons that we do not clearly understand. There are, of course, people are talking about in Bhutan, for example, they've documented deaths of these birds because of the hydroelectric projects and the wires that that are there because of the pylons and all that, which have caused certain deaths and all that. But apart from that, why is it making a silent exit? We are really not aware. Clearly, we can't pin down a single reason for that. We were underprepared. We should have picked this early. We should have probably thought of an intervention maybe a decade ago. We probably were late in also trying to think of an intervention. And I'm really hopeful that we are able to figure out a solution despite this bleak ground situation for the species, at least in India. The future of the habitat, as I just mentioned, is bleak. And this is a story of a species getting knocked out even without much disturbance. I have put much in inverted commas because it doesn't look much to our eyes. When we are seeing the river habitat in Namdapha, or we are seeing signs of fishing presence or other stuff, we don't see a statistically significant signature. but yet the species is making a silent exit from there. And this is something that, we keep celebrating small victories. For example, this year, juveniles were detected, but these victories probably to translate into a bigger victory is something that will require far more interventions than they're currently implemented in the field. Now let's move to hornbills. And here, what I'm going to do is in the heron, I've just spoken about a species. But now what I'm going to try and do is not just talk about a few species of hornbills, but also about the ecosystem process, which is really critical in maintaining the diversity of life in these forests in Eastern Himalaya. Now, hornbills probably don't need an introduction to this audience, but hornbills are these magnificent large birds. They are amongst the largest fruit-eating birds in these tropical forests of Asia and Africa. They evolved in Africa and then they have entered into Asia and then they have diversified especially in Southeast Asian islands. And most of the Asian hornbills, all of the Asian hornbills are primarily frugivorous. That is, their main diet is fruits. They consume fruits and through their large beaks, and they're able to also disperse the seeds without damaging them. And therefore, they play a very critical role in these ecosystems, is something that I'll be talking about. Now, of course, hornbills have very interesting breeding biology. The female seals herself inside the male nest, and the male provides food to the female, which is incarcerated inside the nest. The juvenile birds, some species like the brown hornbill here, you can see that the juvenile birds are then helping the parent in feeding the female and the growing chicks. So they also show cooperative breeding, at least certain species like this brown hornbill shows here. In the Eastern Himalaya, we have 5 species of hornbills, which is again highest in India. Where 5 species of sympatric hornbills are occurring. We have the great hornbill, which is the largest Asian hornbill, weighing up to 4 kilos. The rufous-necked and the wreath hornbill weighing about 2,500 grams, 2.5 kilos. And then the brown hornbill, which is about 750 grams. And the oriental pied hornbill, which is a black and white hornbill, which is again of a small size, which is about 750 grams. Now, hornbills feed on fruits, and fruits, when they ripe, they advertise themselves that they want to be eaten. And this is a mutualistic interaction between frugivorous birds and plants. That when the fruits are ripe, the capsule dehisces and exposes the aril here, which is orange in color, which is telling the frugivore that it's ripe and come and feed. The seed here, which is black, is covered with this lipid-rich aril, and it's a reward for the bird or the animal that feeds on the fruit. The pulp that we see on the fruit or the aril that we see here, or in the case of nutmeg, is a reward for the frugivore to feed and take the seed away from the parent plant. The hornbills are especially really cool because they are able to also feed on seeds that are very large in size. I've purposefully shown seeds in the hands so that you can see that the seeds are very large in size, and not many other birds or animals are able to feed on these seeds or disperse the seeds effectively like the hornbills. Here, this is a fruit of Canarium strictum. Canarium strictum is something that even humans depend on. Apart from the timber, of course, we use the resin, which is used as dhoop in our puja and other functions. There's again another fruit which is basically a disoxylum, where the black part is the aril, which is the lipid rich, which is covering the green seed which is inside. So when the fruit ripens, it dehisces and then exposes the black part, which is an advertisement for the bird to come and feed. So as I said, hornbills are amongst the very few birds that are able to handle the fruits and disperse the seeds without damaging them. Now, why is seed dispersal important in the first place? Because if the seeds don't get dispersed, they will fall below the parent tree. Below the parent tree, lots of seeds will fall, and you would have noticed this, even in your gardens and orchards, that you have fruits falling below the parent tree which get infected by fungal pathogens or which get affected by insects, and then they destroy the seeds, right? And under the parent tree is not really beneficial for the plant. The seed has to escape away from the parent plant for it to escape all of these fungal pathogens and these insects that attack them. Apart from insects, there are also rodents like this brush-tailed porcupine, which is found in the Eastern Himalayan forests, that predate on the seeds and can damage the seeds. The mother plant wants the seed to be dispersed undamaged, and therefore birds like the hornbills, which feed on the fruits and disperse the seeds undamaged, are really critical for these plants, for their seeds to survive and become adult trees. So one of the things that we were really wanted to understand is how many seeds do they disperse, because that will be quantifying the ecological role that they play. Now, this is a seed of a Livistona jenkinsiana palm, which is where the bird has fed on the fruit. And this happened right next to where I was sitting and watching a tree, fruiting tree, waiting for the hornbills to arrive. Oh, hornbill arrived, sat on the tree on below which I was sitting, and it dropped the seed and flew away. And this is what hornbills are doing day in and day out. And we wanted to see how many such seeds are they dispersing in this forest. To do this research, we went to extreme eastern part of Arunachal Pradesh, which is the Namdapha Tiger Reserve. Namdapha is spread over an area of 2,000 square kilometers, very large park, and I just spoke about the heron there. And it has lovely low elevation tropical forests. These are amongst the northernmost tropical forests uh, in the northern hemisphere. And these harbor very high densities of hornbills. Of course, when I was doing my PhD there, most of these forests were inaccessible, and we had to go camp in the forest. We had to hike for days, and we had to camp in the forest to study these birds. One nice thing about camping in the forest was we had hornbills visiting us and other animals like bears, wild dogs, civets, and other animals visiting us on our camp, and we would just lie around and watch these animals from the camp. Now, when I did the research, first thing I did was estimated the densities of these birds, and I found that Namdapha had amongst the highest densities of hornbills in mainland Asia, at least based on the studies that are published for which we could access density information for hornbills. So clearly, you had a site which had very high population densities of hornbills. To estimate how many seeds they're dispersing in the forest, what we did is we put out these 1,600 plots like this. For 2 years, we monitored every 15 days these plots and counted all the seeds that were dispersed. Now, dispersed seeds are easy to determine because they don't have any pulp or aril over it, right? And then they're clean without any pulp. So therefore, we're able to figure out which are the seeds that are dispersed. And also the other thing is that we did not put these plots under the fruiting trees. And so whatever seeds were arriving here were seeds that were dispersed by animals. We focused on large seeds because, as I said, we also demonstrated through some of our other research that only hornbills are primarily dispersing these seeds, because in the forest like Namdapha, you can have more than 40 to 50 species of birds that are feeding on fruits and dispersing seeds. And so to really figure out whether hornbills are doing or not, we focused on these large seeded plants, which only hornbills were dispersing. Now, based on 2 years of data that we had about every 15 days where we counted the seeds and all that, we estimated that hornbills on average were dispersing about 2,500 seeds per day per square kilometer. And this is what gives them the epithet, the gardeners of the forest. They're called the gardeners of the forest because day in, day out, they're dispersing seeds, be it rain or be it sunshine. Now, one interesting thing was that in the patches that we sampled across a 15 square kilometer landscape. And so there were areas where there were only about 600 seeds per day per square kilometer being dispersed, while there were certain patches where as much more than 11,000 seeds per day per square kilometer were being dispersed, right? And so we were figuring out why is this spatial heterogeneity there? And so what we did is we figured out we estimated, counted the number of food plants of hornbills. And what we clearly found is that in areas where their preferred food plants were there, the number of hornbills, which is shown on y-axis here, was actually high, right? And across both the years, we found that where there were food plants were absent, they were typically very low abundances of hornbills. And so hornbills are then basically spending more time in where the food plants are. It's basically they're going to the restaurants to feed. What we also found is that based on the plots that we had, is that where there were more hornbills, which is on the x-axis here now, we found that the number of dispersed seeds of these large seeded plants also was high, right? And so this basically shows that hornbill distribution is governed by the food plants, and in turn, hornbills are then influencing where the seeds are getting dispersed. And what you also then see is that where there are more food plants, where there are more hornbills, is where there are more regeneration of their food plants. So this is basically demonstrating how hornbills are basically shaping the ecosystem. They are shaping the distribution of their food plants. They're shaping how the diversity is distributed in this landscape. Now, this, of course, took us 2 years of fieldwork to determine this. And that was something that we were able to then show that, these hornbills are real key ecosystem engineers in these landscapes and are really critical for maintaining the plant diversity in these landscapes. And no wonder they were getting this epithet of gardeners of these forests. The second thing that we were really interested to look at is how far are hornbills dispersing seeds. Now, why is distance important is because our forests are getting fragmented. They are covered, they are surrounded by inhospitable habitats, either plantations or other land uses, right? Now, these forest fragments, a tree to maintain the genetic diversity of tree here, birds have to feed on fruits, go to other patches, disperse the seeds here. And similarly, when they come from other patches, they bring seeds from other patches. And that will help basically maintain the genetic diversity of plants. Lower genetic diversity is known to impact population or species persistence. So genetic diversity is really critical. And species of birds that can do or animals that can help move seeds between patches is really critical. And therefore, knowing how far are animals dispersing seed is also very, very critical. The second thing is climate change. More habitats are going to become unsuitable. Plants can't move, but their seeds can then be moved by birds like the hornbills and other fruit-eating birds to more favorable climate zones. And therefore, birds that are able to disperse seeds or animals that are able to disperse seeds over large areas can potentially be really critical in ensuring that the genetic diversity of plants is maintained, also allowing plants to escape challenges posed by climate change. This was a study that we did in western part of Arunachal Pradesh in the foothill forests of Paki Tiger Reserve. Now, to understand fine-scale movement pattern of hornbills, we had to trap them and put these GPS tags on them. And that required a lot of team effort. All of this work that I've done is only possible because of the wonderful team that I've had. And we put up this canopy mist nets. These birds are really smart, very sharp vision. So we had to go at 3 a.m. in the morning and put up these mist nets and hope that these birds, over 17 months of field work across 2 years, we caught 17 birds, showing how intelligent these birds are. And we put tags on 6 of these birds, which were male birds, and we were able to get some movement information. Along with this, my colleagues Ushma and Akanksha here, they also then basically also got information on how much time do hornbills get to regurgitate seeds, and incorporating information on seed retention times, how long are the seeds being retained in the gut of the animals. And by getting fine scale information at every 15-minute interval, we were able to then estimate how far are hornbills dispersing seeds from the parent plants. On average, this is a picture of a great hornbill with a tag and a wreath hornbill with a tag. We found that on average, hornbills were dispersing seeds between 252 meters to 1 kilometer from the parent plant. So allowing the seeds to escape. The pressures that the seeds face under the parent plant from seed predators and fungal pathogens. Occasionally, seeds were dispersed greater than 10 kilometers from the parent trees. So clearly, not too many animals in these forests can do dispersal up to 10 kilometers of seeds. But hornbills were the clear agents that were allowing the seeds to be dispersed very far distances. More importantly, they were also visiting the neighboring degraded reserve forests, and therefore they are probably also playing a role in helping regeneration of these degraded reserve forests in this landscape. And so clearly, one of the things that I want to end up here is that these birds are really critical for these ecosystems. They are shaping the way the plants are distributed. They are helping maintain the plant diversity in these landscapes. And and they are also potentially going to play a big role in helping plants fight threats because of climate change and habitat fragmentation and habitat loss. So that's where this ecological role of the species is really, really showcases how important role they're playing. Now, that cannot be said for many other important taxa that are occurring in this landscape, or many other groups of birds for that matter, about what ecological role they're playing. And clearly, the parts of these ecosystems, the species, the groups that we're talking about are really, really critical in shaping the ecosystems that we see from outside. And this is one knowledge gap that we have. This information, to generate this information, has taken about 19 years for us, 20 years, between my research and between my PhD advisor's research of Dr. Aparajita Datta, her research and this research, it took about 20 years to generate. So it takes a lot of time to understand some of these functional roles. And these are also some of these data that I'm presenting of how far they are dispersing seeds, how many seeds are being dispersed, are something that has not been done for Asian hornbills anywhere in South or Southeast Asia. So there's also novel information that we're generating for these groups. But that again, we do not have this information for most of these groups in this landscape, which is hyper diverse. And this is a time that I think we've looked at as fragile species. We've looked at how these groups can really play a very important role in structuring these ecosystems and all that. And this is the right time for us to now start thinking of how humans are also playing a role in these ecosystems. And this is where I'll try and link the humans with the hornbills and their habitats. Now, hornbills are integral part of the local culture of Arunachalis. They have folklore, they have taboos. There are clear taboos that say that hornbills should not be hunted during the breeding season. Because the female is inside the nest, if you hunt a male hornbill, the female and the chicks will die, and that will be a curse. So there are clear folklore about the nesting, about the taboos that are there with associated with hunting and all that. And also the body parts of hornbills form important parts of their traditional costumes. Here you can see that the Nishi tribesman is actually wearing a casque, the beak, the upper beak of the great hornbill. Or the Wancho tribesmen here are wearing the tail feathers of these great hornbills on their caps, right? And so they're very integral part of their traditional costume. And also locals consume meat of the hornbills. Their body fat is thought to have medicinal values. And also often these are also displayed. Hunters display these hornbills as their trophies in their houses. So there is a lot of value to these hornbills, which people attribute. So which is cultural, which is also consumptive. Now, apart from the connection with the hornbills as part of the local culture, the other aspect is also the dependency of these local communities on the habitats where the hornbills are living. Now, of course, there is logging, which is driven by market forces, but also, which is some of it is legal, some of it is illegal. And these logging basically means that they come at direct conflict with the hornbills. Many of the hornbill food plants are large trees, which are also harvested for logging, like Canarium, like Phoebe, which are important, good timber material. Hornbills nest in large trees. These are large birds. These are cavity nesting birds, something that I will talk about very soon. But they need large trees for nesting. These trees are also preferred by loggers, like the dipterocarps. And so what happens is a combination of these two threats, where hunting results in direct loss of individuals from the community, and logging either results in reduced availability of nesting opportunities or reduced availability of food resources, can be expected to impact hornbills in forest, is something that we wanted to understand. So what we did is we replicated the study that we were doing inside Namdafa about looking at the abundance of their food plants, how they are spatially distributed, how the hornbill densities are varying across space, how the number of seeds they're dispersing, and the regeneration of these food plants. We did this again in another site in the Miao Reserve Forest, which is just adjoining to Namdafa. The only difference is that there's no hunting of hornbills, there's no illegal logging happening inside the tiger reserve, but logging is happening outside in the Miao Reserve Forest, as well as hunting of these birds is happening outside in the Miao Reserve Forest. And so this gave us an opportunity to understand how logging and hunting are impacting hornbills. Now, as I said, logging can be expected to directly impact the availability of food plants. And one of the things that I was kept mentioning is that many of the important hornbill food plants are also targeted by logging. And this figure will essentially show you that. Now here, basically what I'm showing is species that are targeted by logging is what are called logged. For example, Dipterocarpus microcarpus is targeted by logging, or Belch media, or say Phoebe species is targeted by logging. Now, Phoebe is a food plant of hornbill that is also targeted by logging. But on the other hand, there are other species that are not targeted by logging, right? And then there are these strangler figs, which because of their milky latex and because they do not have very straight bolls and all that, are often not targeted by logging. So here we had three different categories. So we classified the hornbill food plants into species that are targeted by logging, species that are not targeted by logging, and strangler figs. And we compared the less disturbed sites with the heavily disturbed sites. Here, what I'm showing is just the numbers of trees per hectare in the less disturbed sites. And you can clearly see that this number itself is higher. So many of the trees of basically the take home message is that many of the trees of hornbill food plants are actually targeted by logging. And when you look at the impacts of when you see the impacts of logging, they are very clear. In the case of strangler figs, there is no difference in the less disturbed and the heavily disturbed sites. But in the case of the species that are targeted by logging, their numbers are drastically declining, which means that there is reduced availability of fruit resources in these heavily disturbed sites. Now, in the heavily disturbed sites, apart from reduced availability, they are also targeted by hunting. And what is then happening is that in the heavily disturbed sites, you're hardly seeing any hornbills. Now, what also as a consequence of that, what is happening is that the number of seeds that are getting dispersed in the heavily dispersed site itself is very, very low. And then what, as a consequence of that, we're also seeing is that here, why I'm showing the recruitment, that is number of recruits, saplings or seedlings of one particular plant species, we did it for multiple species, and we saw the same pattern. Here I'm showing for one plant species for different size classes, and you can see that consistently in the heavily disturbed sites, there is poor recruitment. Now, many of the trees that hornbills feed on are also important for human beings, like the phoebe, canarium, right? And so with the loss of these hornbills because of hunting or because of excessive logging, it is also going to come back and impact humans. At least their resource use, or at least the availability of the resources in the long run is definitely going to get impacted. These trees that we're talking about that are targeted by logging are at least several hundred years old, at least the large trees that we're talking about. So these forests are not going to come back immediately. And so these are repercussions of these human activities on these habitats for the long term. And so these ecosystems, because of the disturbances, either because of loss of hornbills to hunting and logging, are getting permanently altered, and something that is going to be very difficult to reverse. The next thing that we were interested in is, okay, fine, this is something that we are seeing in eastern part of Arunachal in one particular site, but what is the status of hornbills across the state of Arunachal Pradesh? And here I am showing a map of Arunachal Pradesh and the sites that we sampled. The hornbills typically occur below 2000 meters, and therefore we sampled in areas below 2000 meters. Now, the nice thing about this study is that we had independent sites. So we sampled multiple protected areas, we sampled multiple reserve forest sites and multiple community forest sites. In Arunachal Pradesh, the sites are basically, forests are also classified as community or unclassed state forests, where the local traditional ways of management of these forests is implemented. The reserve forests are also, run by the forest department based on their existing working plans. And the protected areas, are where the extractive forces like logging and all that are fairly limited. Now, these two figures are basically showing basal area and tree density, which is a measure of how good the forest is or the forest structure. Tree density is basically number of trees per hectare. And this is for three categories. The protected area is on the left, the reserve forest is in the middle, and the community forest on the right. And you can see that the tree density is actually lower in the reserve forests compared to the protected areas and community forests. The community-owned forests are comparable, similar tree densities compared to the protected areas. When you look at the basal area, of course, it's a bit altered here, but reserve forests have far lower basal area, of course, because of history of legal logging in these landscapes, probably, that has resulted in low basal area. Basal area is indicative of prevalence of large trees in these landscapes, right? And so basically you have the community-owned forests that are actually comparable to the protected areas, and they're actually better off in terms of habitat for these birds, for these hornbills. But when you look at, because we were walking transects in these sites, when you look at the encounter rates of hornbills, you will see that we hardly had any encounters in the community forests. Of course, there is a lot of variation even in the protected area sites, but consistently the confidence intervals for the community forests overlap to zero, right? Indicating that though the forests are actually better in the community forests, hornbills are essentially very, very rare in these forests, probably because of hunting. Now, what we also documented based on key informant surveys that we did, we interviewed more than 75 people, and these were mostly hunters. Now, because of the strong connections, cultural connections of hornbills with the local people, the local hunters are able to identify hornbills species very, very accurately. They will clearly tell you there is, sir, एक पंछी है जिसका बीच में काला है, ऊपर सफेद, नीचे सफेद, which is the great hornbill. एक का आधा काला पूंछ है, आधा काला सब, which is the rufous neck. So they are able to very clearly distinguish based on their beak, based on their body size, based on their colors, these different species of hornbills. And we basically tapped into that ecological knowledge, and we asked them whether they had seen this particular species of hornbill in the last 5 years. Now, of course, because of their different distributions and all that, the number of potential sites for these different species differed. But if you just take the example of the great hornbill, where the potential sites where the species can occur based on the ecology or the geography of the landscape is about 16, at least in 5 sites, the local hunters said that they had not seen the bird in the last 5 years, indicating local extinction of the species, right? Even for the small bodied hornbills, which are not typically targeted for their body parts, unlike the larger hornbills, they were also being reported locally extinct, potentially locally extinct in multiple sites. So highlighting that these birds are really, really vulnerable to especially hunting. Now, why are these birds vulnerable to hunting? And this is where I think it's a good time to look at the breeding biology of these birds. I am showing a video of the great hornbill at the nest. You can see that the tree is very large. This is the Tetramelis nudifloral tree. The girth would have been at least 300 centimeter, at the base, right? So it's a very, very large tree, you know. And then you have the male bird that is coming and feeding the female. The female is locking herself inside this cavity for almost 4 months. The male is singly going, feeding or finding these patchily distributed fruits, getting them and feeding. At a visit, they can feed their small fruits, almost about 200 fruits in a single visit that they can feed. For 4 months, the male bird is doing that. The female is inside with a chick. And after 4 months, in 1 year, they're raising one chick. Now, these are large birds. They typically also occur in low densities. They also have low birth rate. Given the combination of these two, this makes them very, very vulnerable to hunting. We did some offtake rate estimations based on the densities in Namdapha. So assuming that if the forest had as many birds as there were in Namdapha, we found that even low levels of offtake rates of few individuals every year or per unit area and all that, it would basically knock out on this in a fairly short span of time. So this combination of slow breeding rates, they take 4 years to reach sexual maturity, the great hornbill, and raising only one chick a year probably makes them really vulnerable to threats like hunting, which are more localized. Now, based on the surveys that I did during my PhD and subsequently after my PhD. So, for example, this was a big knowledge gap for us. We spent one season looking for hornbills in this landscape. This is in Siam. And what we found is that, there were three teams. In fact, apart from our team, there were two surveys that were done in Mauling National Park around that time, both led by very competent bird watchers, and they did not see any rufous necked hornbill here. We spent a season here and we saw a single pair of rufous necked hornbill. Of course, the hunters would occasionally get these birds at they would occasionally be able to hunt, but they would have to go very far distances. So if you remember the map that I showed in Arunachal, you had 60% of forest cover. Most of it is below 2000, which is very potential habitat for these birds. But if you look at where the hornbill hotspots are based on our field surveys and all that, we've identified basically three hotspots. One is the Eagle's Nest, one is the Pake Tiger Reserve, and one is the Namdafa Kamlang area. Many other places, these birds have become really, really rare or probably also functionally extinct. What I mean by functionally extinct is, you saw that there were about 15 to 20 birds per square kilometer or 100 birds per square kilometer that were dispersing as many seeds per day per square kilometer. But they're hardly very, very low densities that they would hardly be contributing to regeneration of plants and maintaining plant diversity and all that. So basically, you have an area where there is large forest cover, and yet in many of these places, birds like these hornbills have gone functionally extinct. Now, hornbills are not the only animals to be targeted, right? There are also other groups of animals that are targeted, primates, these birds like the bulbuls and the barbets. You have the small carnivores. These are also, even to an extent, these ungulates are playing a very important role in seed dispersal. Of course, the ungulates are also playing an important role in herbivory, and then you have the squirrels that are playing a role in seed predation. And so there are different ecosystem processes I'm talking about. There is herbivory, there is seed predation. All of this is really important in maintaining the diversity in these tropical forests. But hunting is fairly pervasive, and therefore we don't know what is happening because of the loss of these groups. How loss of these groups is impacting these ecosystems is something that we really fully understand yet. Of course, there is one study that is showing that the trajectory of these plants. Now, these tropical wet forests are having mostly and plants whose seeds are dispersed by animals, and up to 90% of plants could be in these habitats where seeds are dispersed by animals. Their trajectory shifting from predominantly animal dispersed plants to then having species that are having more abiotically dispersed plants. These biotically dispersed plants, that is, and plants that are dependent on animals for dispersal of their seeds, their prevalence is actually decreasing. So we are causing shifts in communities. because of loss of these important groups. And many of these things we still poorly understand, highlighting the need for more research, more targeted research to understand how these forests are getting altered permanently. Of course, hunting is one threat that I spoke about, but there are also other threats that I will briefly touch upon. Now, this was a study done in 2002 where they looked at amount of forest cover loss between 1991 to 2001, which overlapped with the Bodo insurgency. More than 230 square kilometers of lowland forest, which is also preferred habitat of the hornbills, was lost, where it's now become permanently settled, you know, during this period of Bodo insurgency. So there are other threats, other potential threats which are causing threats to biodiversity here. I was talking about logging. This was a study that was done just outside the Pake Tiger Reserve, and within 4 years, there was a reduction in about 4% of forest cover or intact forest cover in this landscape, as was shown by Chintan Set and others. Now, there are lots of potential drivers of this, some of them that we've touched upon, and some of them have changed over time. The population densities have increased. Though, when we look at the population densities of Arunachal Pradesh, it's only about 17 people per square kilometer, per 100 square kilometer, which is far lower than what is there in India. But yet the population densities are increasing. There are, of course, other things that are happening along with it. There are, the technology, the traditional ways of hunting are being replaced by modern guns. There is infrastructure, roads, dams, other things coming up. The market forces like the demand for timber, which of course is not local, which is driven by people who are demanding this timber, the plywood or the main or the poles from outside Arunachal Pradesh, which basically is also driving the logging there. There's of course cultural erosion, and also insurgency, which is contributing to variable levels of threats because of hunting and logging. Of course, geographically, the relative importance of these threats might change. Of course, is something that we poorly understand. And all of this is then having an impact on these ecosystems permanently. Now, while I'm talking about mostly hunting and some of the other localized threats, of course, I've touched upon logging, which is more larger scale threat. We also have other threats that are coming into the landscape. I spoke about 150 proposed dams. Some of the construction of some of the dams has already begun. Is going to permanently alter the demography of people, the landscapes, the riverscapes in these systems. Oil palm is being promoted at large scales. Roads are being constructed. Many of them are required. And but then also linear intrusions are also associated with also other potential changes in biodiversity and ecosystem function, which impacts mobility of animals, which impacts uh, you know other stuff about diversity and stuff like that. So all of these larger threats are also coming into these landscapes big time. And so what we have to do is basically brace up for seeing a more rapid loss of biodiversity and ecosystem function probably in these landscapes. So over the last 40, 45 minutes that I've spoken, we've looked actually more 15 minutes that I've spoken, one of the things that has come out is that we know so little about these ecosystems, about the species, about the ecological role that they're playing. Based on the research that is there, we've seen that loss of certain groups, often driven by local scale factors, can permanently alter these ecosystems. With large infrastructure projects that are coming up, these ecosystems might be pushed further to the brink. Shubhra, in her opening talk in the series, she talked about how fragile these mountains are, with terrain and construction, a whole lot of other things. But these systems are not just fragile to infrastructure, but they're also fragile in multiple dimensions. And I hope I've touched on one particular dimension here. But then all is not lost. Now, I would not want to end this talk on a bitter note, and there is always hope, and which is where I draw a lot of inspiration from. This gentleman, Mr. Tanatapi, he basically changed the look of Pake Tiger Reserve. He got local community to participate in conservation. He has basically his efforts have resulted in a lot of positive support for conservation in Pake Tiger Reserve. Very dynamic officer, spent a lot of time, very inspiring leader, and he really brought not just worked with the local communities, he also galvanized all the local organizations, all the national level NGOs and all that. He took all their support, brought all of us together, and he's basically resulted in changing the face of Pake Tiger Reserve. And that kind of personalities really inspire a lot of youngsters who look at him in the landscape itself. Hornbill Nest Adoption Program, which Tanatapi also was partly responsible, is basically a partnership program between local communities, the Forest Department, and the Nature Conservation Foundation. And basically here we have local community members who are going out there in the field, protecting nests from logging, from illegal logging, and also protecting hornbills from being hunted during the breeding season. They're also doing a whole lot of other research on hornbills, and their contribution. There's a lovely documentary which I'll encourage everybody to watch, which is about this nest adoption program, where people talk so passionately about hornbill conservation. Apart from protecting hornbills, there are also efforts for restoring the degraded habitats, which are also again, participate a lot of participation by local communities, and which is also very, very inspiring. And this giving us hope that these landscapes may be protected. Of course, these efforts that I'm talking about, site level efforts, but of course, there are people protesting against violations of legal violations in large infrastructure projects. People are surrendering air guns. Locals are taking leadership. One of my batchmates, Tamodada, he was from Arunachal and he's gone back and he's now contributing to biodiversity conservation there, as per his, based on his profession that he's doing there as a local administrator, which is also very heartening to see. And so all is not lost. Here we have a lovely state, lovely people, lot of cultural connections, lot of connections between biodiversity and people, and where they are taking ownership for ensuring that this biodiversity and these ecosystems last, which is also something which is very, very inspiring, and I take a lot of inspiration from that. And I would like to end my talk here. I thank everyone, and I would specifically like to thank Sartaj, whose artwork I've been using. Sartaj has also traveled with me extensively in these forests, and he's seen these birds and helped me study these birds along with it. And his companionship has been extremely fun and very enriching. Of course, this work would not have been possible without supports of whole lot of other agencies that have supported, my mentors, my friends, my field team, collaborators, friends, the villagers who have graciously, it's such a wonderful thing. I have never worried about where will I get a place to stay while traveling, even at odd hours in Arunachal Pradesh. Local people have very generously hosted us, and it is because of their support and their knowledge and all that they have shared with us is where I think I've been able to learn a lot more about hornbills and about these ecosystems. Some of the work that I've spoken about is in these papers that you can read if you're interested in. This is I will thank you so much for your patience and hearing.
Uh, Thank you so much, Rohit. You covered so much ground and you gave us such rich data from such a longitudinal data also. So before I have questions, I'll open it up to people. So you can just raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask. We have a I think we can manage that. So we can take questions from the audience now. Okay. So maybe I can start. So this is a very broad question actually. You're talking about this necessity for good data and good understanding of what are the risks and also like what are the rewards of conservation. What does the hornbill do? How well does it disperse seeds, etc. So what is the uptake of this, if any, of your study in the policy circles or in government circles, etc. So if and I'll begin with that broad question. And if you have been able to influence conservation in any way in the region.
So this, I think it comes opportunistically. The uptake for this, I think over the years of my engagement, doing research and all that, and engaging with different stakeholders which are interested in biodiversity conservation, one I realized is that in my earlier stages, I have not connected so much. Now that I work with lawyers, with journalists, with other stakeholders, with local communities and all that, I realized that I wish I had done a lot of it earlier. But and by proactively doing that, I would have been able to communicate, my findings and make it more relevant. Having said that, our white-bellied heron stuff, we've had local people who've been, who wanted that information, because, for example, in one cases where this dam was being proposed, and which was a critical heron habitat, and therefore they tapped onto us and they got us to give some comments and give some feedback there. And so that way we were able to, based on our knowledge, based on our experiences there, we were able to contribute to that particular occasion with that. Similarly, our efforts with the research that we are doing in Paki Tiger Reserve, and this is also largely led by my PA, principal investigator, who's been working there since 1996. It has been tremendous. It is fed into our restoration program that is being done there. The local forest department, has been supporting, all the research that our team has gone and found those nests and all that, which now have some semblance of legal protection, is because the forest department recognizes these nest protectors. They recognize the need to save these forests and all that. So I seriously think that, that there is a lot of potential for the research to translate into. Of course, not every piece of literature gets translated into action, but I guess some of it is also our own feelings, that we are unable to communicate it or pass it on to the relevant stakeholders in the right time. But that is something that, at least our group now is trying to fix big time, where we really closely work with journalists and with other stakeholders for conservation, including local communities, so that these knowledge that we are generating is basically passed on and being utilized. Because one of the things that the lawyer told me, is that you guys write scientific papers and put it out. We can't access them or we cannot understand them. So you have to write in the language which is more accessible to us, which is more, available to us easily. And it is really shocking that one of my students had done a review of literature and we hardly found reports on Google. So if a lawyer is sitting trying to fight a case in court, these reports which people have done, reports definitely much more than the papers that get published, are not accessible. And so this is something that we definitely, as scientific community, we need to fix ourselves about making our research being more accessible through popular media, through direct connections with lawyers and engaging with them periodically.
That's very relevant and that's very important for all of us to take note of. So while we are waiting for other questions, Tejaswini has put a question on chat and she says that I wanted to know whether it matters which party is in power in Arunachal. Does the policy towards rampant building of infrastructure projects change in any way? Similarly, policy and attitudes towards conservation, does it change with like political outlook of particular parties?
So in Arunachal Pradesh, no, it is a bit sad, but it is how it is, where, because they're so dependent on the center, right? And so typically they end up aligning with the party which is in the center. So moment there's a change of leadership in the center, the leadership in Arunachal also will change and align itself to the center. And that's just because of the dependencies, right? The other thing is that, of course, there are, the local I think that individuals really matter. We've had a system where right now, for example, the forest minister is really, really supportive, really pushing for the airgun, surrender abhiyan, or, even he's supporting the nest adoption program, or at least he's really, really willing and expressive. So these individuals really matter. And again, going back to the previous point about engaging with them is something that really helps. And therefore, to, basically the party is really not relevant because people keep changing sides. But having said that, the dams and all that, the original MOUs that were signed were way back in 2009 when the government was different. It's being pushed now, later, whatever. Of course, certain things get accelerated based on the agenda of different governments. But then this is something that across governments, I feel that, that some of these dams and some of the larger issues have been happening. For example, I've been seeing this road construction in Namdapha Tiger Reserve being pushed forever, right? So difficult for me to say that, one yeah, party in power in Arunachal would basically just align with the goals of the center. And, but at the center also not seen too much initiative when it comes to, biodiversity conservation or those in the reservation.
Okay, we have one question from Kaushik Jana. He's a professor here, a statistician. Kaushik.
Yeah. Hello. So this is
Hello,
such a hello. This is such a kind of nice talk and the fascinating data that you presented, especially the sampling frame in. I think as a statistician, I am so kind of so interested to see the data, and even I noted down your papers, which I look into and will try to use those data to even teach statistics. So this is because the data itself is a story. Will catch students' attention and then the message behind that data. Just a quick maybe question, and if you can elaborate on this. So Hornbill, you gave us some overview of the data of in Arunachal Pradesh. Is Hornbill also present in other part of India, in other mountains, let's say in South and Western Ghat? And
Yes.
are there any statistics on that as well?
Thank you so much. I'm really glad that when Suchismita said that you're a statistician, you're going to ask me questions. I was like, okay, which graph did I interpret incorrectly? I was thinking. But anyways, I'm glad you liked the research. And the thing is that yes, hornbills are there across the Indian subcontinent. They're mostly found in the wet forests. So you have the Himalayan foothills where you have these hornbills, and then in the Western Ghats we have 4 species of hornbills. In central India, in the most of the drier parts of India, you have the Indian grey hornbill, which is more adapted to live in more drier open habitats. Then you have in the central Indian hills, you have the Malabar pied and the Oriental pied hornbill. They come and they occupy those habitats. So there are totally 9 species of hornbills. 5 are found in Eastern Himalaya. There is one species of hornbill which is endemic to one particular island, an Narcondam Island. And that is also some research. Of course, there is other research on hornbills that I didn't present. And we've done some research on Narcondam hornbill. And if you're really excited about hornbills, that is one paper that I'll definitely pass it on to you. And you'll really enjoy about because that's a different story. You have double the densities. What we see in Namdafa, we have double them in the islands. So yes, they are found in other places. And in Narcondam, in fact, they are playing even more significant role. There are only 7 species of frugivores, and most of the dispersal is being done by this Narcondam hornbill. So they're playing an important role. The other part of the Western Ghats in the hunting part that I said, no, in the Western Ghats in region where we work now in northern Western Ghats in Maharashtra, we hardly have any forest cover which is close to Arunachal Pradesh, but yet hornbills persist. All the 3 species, the 4 species of hornbills are found there in the landscape: the great, the Malabar pied, the Malabar grey, and the Indian grey. And they persist because there are these sacred groves that are large trees that have cavities where they nest. There are ficus trees in the landscape. But because they are not hunted, I would be more confident to show you probably a hornbill in a far easier way in the northern Western Ghats than probably in some parts of Arunachal. Though the habitat might be splendid, their densities might be even rarer there because of hunting. Yeah. Sorry, I gave an additional attachment to the question that you asked. But
Yeah.
yeah, but
Thank you so much. Thank you
yeah,
so much. I look forward to read more paper. I'll visit your website and see the paper.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
So, okay, if I could ask then, okay, Suman, I think, has a question. Suman Malik, he's a PhD student over here uh, in ecology. So he says, thanks for arranging such a nice talk. I would like to know more about if we restore the fish population of these Himalayan rivers, can the heron population be restored as food resource can contribute to restoration of this population?
So that's the thing, no, in the sense that unfortunately we do not have direct information about whether it is the fish availability that is driving their population or keeping their population densities low, or inherently these species are occurring in low densities. And so this is something that will require more research. Just introducing fish is also is going to complicate it because these are also shared landscapes. Like, while Namdafa, you might not have logging happening directly inside the tiger reserve legally, but fishing is something that local communities still do. And so answering that question about adding more fish would lead to more prevalence of heron is right now, at least we don't know whether it's the reduced fish availability which is driving the heron out, or is there something else? So that is something that I would think that would be more priority thing to determine what is driving the heron out in the first place, and then thinking of interventions.
I had a question similarly about whether the changing quality of water or any other aspects like which an hydrology study would help you understand some factors of why the heron is disappearing.
So at least now what we've done is, through a collaboration with SACON and my dear friend Dr. Vidyadhar, who is a ichthyologist, we now have data on fish. So after 5 years, probably, we'll probably can go back and look at what the fish diversity is and how the fish abundances have changed and how the fish body sizes have changed. Yeah, his student has done a fantastic job of collecting information on fish which was missing all this while. So that now we have, and probably in a few years, we'll probably be able to look at some of these aspects of how that fish communities are changing. He's currently analyzing the data. And so maybe, one of the things that he can clearly easily do is compare the fish abundances and fish capture rates and fish body sizes and a lot of other more less disturbed Himalayan river sites and see whether how different they are. Regarding the pollution, no, is it's this is it's a snow-fed river, the Namdapha River, the Noadhing River. There is no industry bound unless there is some pollution that is, and it's a very large area, 1,000 square kilometer landscape, and all the water that is coming from upstream is coming from the protected area itself. The source of the rivers is in the protected area, and so it's
So,
unlikely that sources are polluted. So,
right.
but I don't understand about river pollution, about how
Hmm.
larger source.
I was just thinking, especially with Sikkim, how siltation changes in the river with something like a glacial lake outburst flood. But generally now with climate change, if like siltation processes are changing, so that's a question.
Probably,
Uh,
and that is something, fortunately, he has that information. He's recorded TDS and he's recorded a whole bunch of other water parameters as well. And so that, that itself is going to be very useful baseline. Probably this is something first time that is being collected from the landscape systematically. And so that will probably help in the long term about determining how the water quality itself is changing.
um, okay, and if there are any other questions, you can put it on chat or also just ask. So one of the questions is again this question of hunting in Arunachal Pradesh. It has been a question which has been there for a long time in conservation and question how to address conservation. So because you have worked for 20 years, has that also changed like people's perceptions or interventions regarding hunting as a major stress in this region?
So that is definitely changing. The nest adoption program started right at 2011 or something, right? And so that nest adoption program meant that people were protecting hornbills. Like the local communities were leading charge for protecting hornbills and all that. The air gun surrender abhiyan and all that, is also something that is now being promoted in a larger way. Yesterday, I was reading a news about in Namdafa, where the forest department conducted that air gun surrender abhiyan where people came and surrendered their air guns. And so definitely the you know the direction is changing. It is not that things are much better than they were there earlier, in last 20 years ago. And of course, a lot of local capacity building. Of course, Tamo I spoke about, who was probably the who came and got trained and all that, but he's inspired a bunch of other people who've gone and who've done their masters in wildlife conservation. This Japang Pansa, it's such an interesting story, and I'll take 1 minute to share it. Japang Pansa was a Wancho guy. He was a hunter. And then through that, he started joined the forest department. He worked with Aparajita. And then he's worked with a whole bunch of other researchers and bird two guys. And he completely transformed into becoming a bird guide, and also he's a forest department employee. Excellent natural history and all that. And his daughter, and he barely had any education, but his daughter has now finished MSc forestry, and she's really interested in, or she's doing MSc forestry, and she's really interested in biodiversity conservation. So, you see a full generation, a complete shift in the way things have happened. And that is something which is very inspiring. So I definitely take a lot of positives. There are a lot of positives. A lot of young conservationists coming from Arunachal. One of my colleagues, Chiging Pilia, he went to London, to Oxford, to do his PhD, I think, or Kent. He went to Kent to do his PhD. So on issues related to wildlife conservation. So definitely things are changing.
Okay. Anybody else has a question? Because I keep asking, I don't want to hog the conversation. Another thing which struck me was you said that this hornbill and this distribution of seeds by animals, if that is being disturbed, then these are the trees which are going to be affected, or less chance of better survival. So what would take its place, or like other ways, other trees which will have an advantage in this kind of competition scenario?
So the species, already as I was talking, there's one study that demonstrates it a bit, that wind dispersed species, species that are not dependent on animals for dispersal, but through wind or through gravity or through other abiotic agents, or water or something like that, their prevalence is now increasing in these communities. So one thing is that in these forests, most of the tree species are dependent on animals for dispersal. And now what is happening is that because of loss of these animals, the communities are shifting to species which are abiotically dispersed or which are dispersed by wind, gravity, water. And what it means is that then a large chunk of species are probably not regenerating. So it is having major impact on biodiversity.
Right. And like, how does that change the quality of the forest, or how would you imagine this would change the quality of the forest in the future if this, like in the long term?
So one thing is that, it will change the availability of fruit resources. Now, fruit itself is a major resource for animals. You have monkeys, you have ungulates, you have deer, you have small birds, 50 different species of birds that are feeding on these fruits and all that. In the long run, if these species not generating, the resource availability is going to get compromised. With that getting compromised, it's also going to then lead to another feedback vortex of loss of frugivores and all that. So that is something that is eventually going to get impacted. And also, of course, the diversity is going to of plants is going to reduce in the landscape. So, and which is then associated with bunch of other insects that are pollinating those flowers, bunch of other insects that are feeding on the leaves of those of those trees and all that. Many of these interactions are very specific. So loss of those species also would mean loss of a whole other group of animals that are dependent not just for fruits but other resources from which these plants offer.
And I think your talk demonstrates very well the need to study that, the need to study like the function of different small, big, whatever species in the ecosystem and generate this kind of data, especially in these places where there's so much imminent like threat of extinction. Uh, yeah. So I think those are my questions. I'll wait a little if anybody else has any questions, or we can maybe end any other remaining questions in the chat, or anybody has their hand up. Okay, then I think we can then formally. I'm
Sorry,
sorry,
no, no,
you
you
was.
please.
So I think then we can formally end this talk, and thank you so much, Rohit, for taking so much time and giving us this very rich data and very talking specifically about the risks, but also this need to have good studies, good scientifically backed data, which obviously needs to be disseminated, but the need for documenting different sorts of ecological processes and making it relevant to policy or other interventions. So thank you so much. This is a very interesting and very important contribution to how to think about risk in the region. Yeah, and thank you to all the audience. We had quite a lot, and I think there as a baby Garba and other things which has led people to leave in the last few minutes. But thank you so much, and I think our audience also got a lot from this.